Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to my very first episode of Lor's Library. Today I'm going to be talking about the origins of podracing. Podracing in its sport form consists of multiple racers going around a set track at very dangerous speeds. The objective is to be the first across the finish line, as far as canon is concerned anyway, and that is the premise of podracing. They do take other things into account, such as the racer's lap times and other such variables, but it is more important that the racer crosses the finish line first. Anyway, pod racing events took place all over the galaxy, but it was much more common in the Outer Rim worlds on planets such as Malastare, Theron, and of course Tatooine, as we know from Episode 1. To focus in more so on the pod races themselves now, as they stand, they are actually one-man repulsor craft vehicles propelled by turbine engines, the number of which would vary depending on the pod racer itself, but usually you would have 2 engines per pod racer. Now the thing that makes pod racers very unique is that they are actually built by their own driver, so the driver of the pod racer for the actual event would have been the person who built his own pod racer, and that is what made it distinctive in comparison to other such sports at the time. For example, swoop racing was very common in the Star Wars: The Old Republic universe, but it is different to pod racing in the sense that they don't have to build their own swoop vehicles. In pod racing it is mandatory, it is tradition, that the actual driver is responsible for the construction of his pod racer. So basically a pod race was only ever as reliable as the driver and the mechanics who built it, and the common flaw of that is that you'd have these tournaments, and during the tournaments these pod races would basically just fall apart due to bad craftsmanship, and sometimes it wouldn't even start, as we are very aware from Episode 1. As you can imagine, it is basically crucial that the mechanics and of course the driver are all very experienced when handling the car. On top of that, there is also the terrifying fact that your average pod racer can achieve speeds of around 1,000 kilometers an hour, with the minimal speed being 800 kilometers an hour, so no matter what you're doing with the pod racer, you're always going to be going at these ludicrous speeds. It is in fact estimated that Anakin achieved top speeds of nearly 1,500 kilometers an hour during the Bunta Eve Classic event on Tatooine in 32 BBY, so in contrast to a normal car, your average hatchback tends to go around 100 to 120 miles an hour at top speeds. So yeah, a pod racer is 10 times faster than your average car. So for those of you who haven't seen the prequels, here's some footage to show you how dangerous pod racing actually is. As you can see, pod racing is a very dangerous sport, but the question is, where did it come from? And how long has it been since pod racing actually started? Well, pod racing, as far as we can tell, has been around since before the Old Republic era. Based on official Legends documentation, it's actually indicated that the roots of pod racing traces back to a time before space travel, a time when people rode on these animal-drawn carts rather than official pod racers. This could actually be any time prior to 37,000 BBY, so the controversial belief that there is no pod racing in the Old Republic era is completely false for those of you who are confused by that. So of course this is a time before the Jedi settled on Tython. However, this is all very vague, we don't know the exact date of when pod racing actually started, but the first recording instance of pod racing was on Tatooine with these Hano speeders, which was a prior version of the land speeder, where exalted Hutt Bunta Hestilik Shadru, formerly known as Bunta, was victorious in a great war between the Hutt clans and their nemesis at the time, Doretha Zim, a tyrant who led the Tynese against the Hutts. This war concluded with the Hutt faction defeating the Tynese, and all of this occurred in 25,130 BBY and ended in 25,100 BBY. So this was a time between the Old Republic era and the beginning of the galaxy as far as we know, with the Jedi landing on Tython. Bunta henceforth was considered to be godworthy as far as the Hutts were concerned, even to the point where the planet Kovari was renamed Bunta in his honor. Following this, Bunta also received a special day called Bunta's Eve, where he would be worshipped every year for 25,000 years with his own annual pod racing event, as we know from the prequels, because Anakin of course wins the Bunta's Eve Classic, which is the event that is dedicated to Bunta's honor. So to summarize, the origins of pod racing dates back tens of thousands of years before the prequels, and in fact continues to this day. More recently, however, in 1 BBY, just before the Battle of Yavin, the Galactic Empire pushed out a new rule in an attempt to banish pod racing. This movement was called the Imperial crackdown, where suddenly pod racing became outlawed across the galaxy, and most pod racing tournaments fell apart due to financial cuts from sponsors refusing to invest in the sport after it became illegal. The motives for why the Empire did this are relatively unclear, but it's believed that due to its largely non-human appeal, the sport was destroyed for racist reasons. And if you didn't know, the Empire doesn't like non-humans too much. They're a rather human supremacist sort of faction. Anyway, those who continued the sport against the law often disappeared or were arrested due to Imperial agents seizing races and their equipment. It is actually also believed that the Imperial agents simply killed races in service to the Empire. Anyway, within a few years of the Empire's rise to power, pod racing was more or less gone from the galaxy. Only few supporters actually have survived the event, and little is known of their position as of 34 ABY, which is during the Force Awakens. So as of right now, we're not 100% sure what's happened to pod racing, but as far as we know, there are still strong heart supporters out there. We're just not sure if they're actually engaging in the sport because the Empire, or now known as the First Order, are back in power. So we'll have to, of course, receive more documentation and more books to sort of understand what's happened to pod racing more recently. So there we have it. That's my very first episode of Lor's Library. I really hope you guys have learned something new, whether it's something to do with the origins of pod racing in general, or the more recent affairs of pod racing. I just really hope that something went in and you guys have enjoyed the episode. And again, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Bye, guys.